Good afternoon. My subject for my message today is on the subject of overcoming pride. And we're talking today about the story of a man by the name of Naaman that we read about in the Old Testament. Now, in speaking to your children whenever they were young, how many were ever concerned that they may have had a problem with their hearing because they seemed to ignore everything that you said? Sometimes they acted as if you were speaking just to hear yourself talk. And I'm afraid that's how God feels many times when we totally ignore what it is that He is saying, and we are acting just as if He's speaking to hear Himself talk. Folks, God does not speak to be heard. God speaks to be obeyed. And whenever we hear the voice of God, we're not supposed to just hear it and go on our merry way and do nothing. We are supposed to hear it and to obey it. Now, whenever you ladies ask your husband or one of your children to do something, probably the first thing that comes out of their mouth is something to the effect that after a while, or I'll do it whenever I get time, or whatever. When we hear the voice of God, folks, we are supposed to immediately obey it and do what God says. We don't say to God, I will do it after a while, or I'll do it whenever I get time. So in my message today, we're going to see a man by the name of Naaman who had to overcome his pride in order to be healed of his leprosy. He had to forget about the fact that he was a great man in the eyes of the king of Syria. He was the reason that Syria had been so victorious in all of their battles with other nations. He was a mighty man of valor. So in order to be healed, he simply had to obey the command of God through his servant Elisha to go and wash himself 7 times in that dirty, nasty Jordan River, which must have been repulsive to a great man like him. Naaman's pride almost resulted in the rejection of the only remedy for his condition. Just as pride almost cost Naaman the healing from his leprosy, pride can also rob us of many of the good things in our lives. When I was growing up in Appalachia, for example, jobs of any kind were few and far between. I knew a man one time who quit the best job that he ever had with no thought of the financial impact on his family and no idea as to how his family was going to support him, simply because he got into an argument with his boss and he decided to show him, if you would, by quitting his job. Folks, whenever we do things like that, the only thing that we're showing is our short-sightedness and our lack of good judgment. I know marriages, and I'm sure you do too, that have fallen apart simply because one or both of the spouses refuse to swallow their pride and simply say, I'm sorry, please forgive me. And we all know families where relationships have been estranged for years over what amounts to nothing more than pride. How many have the type of relationship and the courage to talk to your boss and to tell them they are wrong about something? When Naaman was about to let his pride get in the way of his healing, some of his servants had the courage to tell him that what he was doing was wrong and call his attention to the folly of his behavior. You see, to Naaman's credit, however, he was willing to swallow his pride and obey the Lord's command to go dip in the Jordan River. Naaman's story is told in the book of 2 Kings, the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 15. And the first verse of that scripture tells us that Naaman was a great man in the army of Syria. But despite that, he still had leprosy. Now, as you may recall, leprosy was one of the most feared diseases of the time, much as the coronavirus is today. Now, in its worst form, leprosy often led to death, and many lepers were quarantined in villages outside the main city. Because Naaman still held his post, he probably had a less serious skin condition like psoriasis or eczema, but nevertheless, whatever his condition might have been, it was probably in its early stages. Now, the strategy of the Syrians against Israel at this particular point in time was that they dispatched small bands of soldiers and they engaged the Israelites at certain locations. And often they captured both goods and people. It was during one such excursion that the Syrians, they had lost one of their, what the scripture calls, little maids or young girls to Syria. Although it would have been quite normal for this little girl to have been bitter against her captors, she didn't do that. And like this little girl, folks, we as Christians cannot feel bitter and hatred toward people who have mistreated or offended us in some way. This young girl apparently developed a great deal of respect for Naaman, whose wife she served, and which probably says a lot about the way that Naaman and his wife treated this young girl. You see, as Christians, folks, we need to treat people who are under our direction and control as we would want them to treat us. You see, but how do we treat our children? How do we treat our employees? How do we treat the mailman? How do we treat the man who delivers our newspaper? How do we treat the homeless or the beggar and those in society who are helpless? I don't know about you, but I've heard many Christians talk to these people in an awful manner, and we simply cannot do that. We must talk to these people as we would like for them to talk to us, and more importantly, as we know Jesus would treat them. Now, one day, this young girl, she expressed her concern for Naaman's condition to his wife. And then somebody went to the king, probably Naaman himself, and told the king about what this young girl had told Naaman. Now, the king's response reflected a sense of urgency regarding Naaman's comment, you see, because his comment was, indeed, by all means, go. And so this king, he was indicating his concern for Naaman and his respect for Naaman on the battlefield. Now, like the king of Syria, our response to matters of importance usually reflect a sense of urgency. For example, when someone you know is having a heart attack, we get to the hospital as soon as possible. Or when one of our children calls from the local jail, we get down there as quickly as we can. Or when our best friend is rushed to the hospital in critical condition, we drop everything and rush to the hospital. But let me ask you a question. How do we feel toward spreading the gospel? which should be the most important thing in our lives. Does spreading the gospel have the same sense of urgency as some of these things that I have mentioned? Folks, it should. In fact, it must. Now, in addition to the king of Syria writing a letter to the king of Israel, Naaman took with him lots of different items. First of all, he took 10 talents of silver. Now, to give you an idea how much money that was, the king of Israel had once paid only 2 talents for the land upon which they built the entire city of Samaria. And so Naaman also took with him 6,000 pieces of gold, which would be roughly $1 million in U.S. currency. And he also took 10 changes of clothes, which would have been significant even for today. Now, the letter that the king of Syria wrote to the king of Israel reflected the pagan mindset of the Syrians. So he apparently either thought that the prophet reported to the king, or that the king would have known the prophet so well that he could have put in a good word for Naaman. Now, when the king of Israel read this letter that the king of Syria had written to him, he didn't think of Elisha at all. What he thought was, am I God to kill or to make alive? You see? So when Elisha heard about the king of Israel rending his clothes in fear of the king of Syria, he took the king off the hook by telling him to send Naaman to him, and he would handle the matter for the king. So Naaman came to the house of Elijah with his typical military entourage of horses and chariots and lots of other things. Now, no doubt, he wanted to try to impress Elisha with just how important he was and how worthy he was of the prophet's attention. You know, we do lots of things like that, trying to impress other people. You know, we buy certain types of cars, we move into certain houses, we move into certain parts of town, we send our kids to certain schools, we shop at certain stores, and lots of things of that nature. Now, in most pagan societies, for which Syria was very knowledgeable, a prophet showed great respect for the king and for other people. So quite naturally, Naaman expected Elisha to come out of his house and to show the proper respect for Naaman in his position. Now, if that's how he felt, he was probably disappointed, because Naaman, when he came to Elisha's house, Elisha didn't even come out of the house. Rather, he sent a servant out and told Naaman to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and then his leprosy would be healed. And so Naaman, he was furious because the prophet hadn't even come out to see him, and even more so, he was concerned about this ridiculous prescription, if you would, for his leprosy. So, you know, the rivers of Damascus were lots better than the dirty Jordan River. And besides that, the Jordan River was some 20 miles away. And so verse 11 of this story tells why Naaman was so furious. According to this verse, Naaman said, I thought. You see, Naaman was furious because he was doing too much thinking. You know, he thought that things were not going as he thought they should. And so sometimes thinking can cause us lots of problems. When God speaks, folks, we're not supposed to think. We are supposed to obey. When God speaks, we're not to rationalize and think about what we bring to the table or what we have to offer God. What we need to do is we need to do the will of God. You see, David thought that having Uriah killed to cover up David's infidelity with Bathsheba was the right thing to do. You see, King Saul, he thought that usurping the role of the priest and offering offerings to God on his own was the way that he should do it. Lot's wife thought that the best way of remembering her city was to look back. Ananias and Sapphira thought that the best thing to do was for them to withhold some of the money that they had got for the land that they had sold, that they planned to give to the church. A single woman today thinks that sleeping with a man is all right because he is her fiancé. Now, regarding a fiancé and regarding thinking, let me tell you this little story. A young woman brought her fiancé home to meet her parents. And after dinner, the mother of this young girl asked her father to take this young man into his study and to talk to him to see if he could find out what his plans were. And so the man invited this girl's fiance into the study, and so whenever they got in there, he started talking, and so this father asked this man what his plans were. Now, this young man told the father that he was a ministerial student, and the father said, that's very admirable, but what are you going to do about providing my daughter with the engagement ring that she deserves? And this young man offered, he said, in what he said to the father, he said, I will concentrate on my studies and God will provide. And so this man then asked him, what about the house that he thought his daughter deserved? And this young man said, well, I'm going to study hard and God will provide for us. And then the man asked him, well, what about children? How are you going to support the children that you and my daughter will probably have? And this young man said, don't worry, sir. He said, God will provide. And so the conversation went on like this. And each time the father asked the young man a question, the young man's response was, God will provide. And so after the young man left, the mother asked the father how it had gone. And the father said this, he has no job, no plans, and he thinks I'm God. You see, so sometimes we have a tendency to overthink things like that, and that invariably gets us into trouble. You see, sometimes we do all of this thinking, but folks, when God speaks, we don't think, we simply act. Now, Naaman rightfully pointed out that the rivers closest to him were better, cleaner, fresher than the rivers of Israel. So why couldn't he wash in one of those rivers? And his logic seemed very reasonable, so he went away in a rage. And he was about to let his pride get in the way of his healing. Now, clearly Naaman's ego had taken a beating. And he had come to Elisha with a clear set of expectations, and none of those expectations had been met. And sometimes we do the same thing with God. We come to God with great expectations, But sometimes God doesn't meet those expectations in the way that we think he should. And so like Naaman, we decide that we're going to quit. We're out of here. We don't have to take this. You've hurt my feelings. And so not many people have the courage to approach their boss when they feel that he or she is wrong. But Naaman, as I mentioned before, he was blessed to have some very discerning and very courageous servants who took it upon themselves to try and get him to come to his senses, which he did. Now, verse 14 of this story says this: Then they went down and dipped themselves 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh came again like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. See, when Naaman obeyed what it was that the prophet Elisha had said, and he went down to the river, Naaman did, and he dipped himself, not 1 time, not 2 times, not 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, but the 7th time that he dipped himself, as the prophet of God had said, then he came out and his leprosy was healed. I think there are at least 2 valuable lessons in this story of Naaman. And the first lesson is, folks, we need to be obedient instead of questioning things all the time. Now, it's okay to question things, and some of the great men of God have done that. But after having raised questions, we need to obey what it is that God is telling us to do. And the second lesson is that we need to adhere to the ways of God instead of complaining all the time about any number of things. Because you see, people who have a tendency to complain about everything. So these are 2 valuable lessons that we can gather from this lesson with regard to Naaman. Now, the final verse of the text says this: And he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and came and stood before him, and he said, Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. You see, Naaman had overcome his pride, and he was a different man, both on the inside and on the outside. So you see, Naaman was not merely adding God to the list of gods that he already worshipped. Rather, he was acknowledging that the God of Israel was the only God in all the earth. You see, and earlier Naaman had referred to the Lord as the God of Israel. But now he was affirming to Elisha that your God is my God. Thank you very much and have a great day.